Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for joining us. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Good morning. Thank you for joining us. We'll get started in just a few minutes as folks continue to trickle in. Good morning, everyone. We're just going to give it a few more minutes to allow some more folks to jump on the Zoom, and we'll get started soon. Good morning, everyone. My name is Sofia Leyva. I am with Claymore Space. We are a justice-focused event company that has been working in partnership with the center. I am here as your room host. I will be working with our moderator to lift up questions and make sure that our panelists can be seen and heard, and make sure that the show is all about them. So please feel free to use the chat functions and use the Q&A to bring up any questions that you have, comments. We're so glad that you're here. This session is legislative public policy solutions and partnerships. I'm really excited. I'm going to hand it over to our speakers and our moderator.
Thank you, Sofia. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 3 of the Power Inclusion Summit. It is a pleasure to welcome you all. And I'm excited to be, my name is Ethelind. I am here at the center, and I'm excited to welcome our 3 very esteemed panelists, Pahoua, Hoffman, Brad, and Maura, to join us in a conversation today. So we really want to make this a very engaged session. So we will have some engagement questions in the chat box for you to respond to. And while we do that, for our panelists, would you mind just sharing with us a little bit about who you are, your name, your organization, and really some brief comments about your background and how you ended up in policy? And I can start with Pahoua if you want to jump in.
Volunteer, Brett. Good morning, everybody. I'm Pahoua Hoffman. Currently, I am at the St. Paul and Minnesota Foundation. I oversee our grants team. But prior to this newish role, I've been in this job for 7 months. Prior to that, I was the executive director for the Citizens League, a small public policy nonpartisan nonprofit based in St. Paul. And one of the things I think all of us talked about was how do we get here? How do we get into working in the policy space? And for me, it was the start of my career in 2008. I had begun working at the Twin Cities public television station, and they had an open position that was government affairs. I had no idea what that was, what that meant, what that person did. But they were interested in training me, and I was interested in learning, and I got matched up with a seasoned lobbyist who helped me navigate the Capitol, the rulemaking, and I ended up loving it, and at times not loving it, but stayed with it, and excited to be here with Brett, Maura, and Ethelind.
Hey everybody, my name is Brett Grant, and I am with Voices for Racial Justice. I'm Research and Policy Director there. And I think for me, how I came to this position, I was in grad school in Illinois, and I was in an education policy program, and my research topic was holistic education, and really looking at that from a policy standpoint. I've always wanted education to be more than just sitting in a classroom, but to focus on all the different contexts that inform education. But it was all theoretical. And so when I finished the program, a friend of mine told me about this organization, Voices for Racial Justice, and they were looking for a research and policy director. And their approach to racial justice was holistic. And so I thought this will be a wonderful opportunity to apply some of that theoretical knowledge I got in grad school into real world situations at the Capitol. And so like Pahoua, it's, I've been here since 2015. It's been a love-hate relationship, and I'm just learning every day.
Hi all, good morning. My name is Maura Brown. I'm the Associate Director at the Alliance for Metropolitan Stability. We're a coalition of 33 community-based organizations, and we do all of our work in partnership. Our organizations have come together to advance racial, social, and economic justice in the way that development and growth happens in the Twin Cities region. We've been focused on racial equity in that since around 2002, when our community-based partners really felt that that was a need that was very much missing from the landscape of what was happening at the policy level. I personally came into this, I grew up interested in questions of power and questions of who had voice and who had the ability to control the narrative. This partially from my Irish background, where I was taught that our family was colonized and displaced from our land by as tenant farmers and faced with famine. So the narratives that I grew up with were really around solidarity with people who were facing similar struggles around the globe. And then I went to college out on the East Coast, and while I was there, I read stories about my neighborhood that described it here in Minneapolis as a ghetto. And it really struck me that somebody outside of the community with no relationship to the community was defining it from a very deficit-based narrative, as opposed to the assets that I felt surrounding me every day when I was growing up in community. So I made the decision to come back here and organize with low-income tenants. I joined the Alliance a long time ago as a coalition organizer, and really everybody, despite whatever our titles are at the Alliance, at our heart are coalition organizers. And that's how we approach the work. And that's what we believe no individual organization has the solutions that are needed. We need to be working at this across issue areas and across geographies and across race and ethnicity.
Thank you for that. You all have really diverse backgrounds, and looking at our attendees as well, they're coming from different organizations, different backgrounds. So that actually leads me to a question. I don't know if it can be answered in a sentence, but what is public policy? What does that conjure up for you? And I will throw that in the chat box as well, because I'm interested in how our attendees are also responding to the question. So what is public policy? Maura, do you want to jump in, since I see you on my camera, so I might as well.
Public policy is really just the decisions that are made in any realm that affect all of our lives. So those can be made at the local municipal level, those can be made at the regional level with Metropolitan Council, those are made at the state level, those are made at the federal level. Often public policy is just a fancy word for decisions that are made by people we elect that impact our lives. I think public policy is a term that is alienating to many people because we don't see ourselves as necessarily participating in public policy decisions on a day-to-day basis. It feels abstract and removed, but it's really, I believe in the old feminist slogan, you know, the personal is political, and what is happening in our day-to-day lives is often impacted by decision-making that we don't have a firm, clear view into. When I started organizing with low-income tenants, then I went to neighborhood organizing, and it became so clear to me that the impacts on the neighborhood were being made at other decision-making levels, and we needed to have access and clear sightlines into who was making those decisions and with what information and with what narratives.
And Brett, Brett, do you want to jump in with what is public policy?
Oh no, go ahead, please.
No, please go ahead. Thank you.
I can tell you, like, for me, it conjures up these like Capitol buildings, suits and high heels and long hallways and this space that's very difficult to just be myself in when I think about public policy. But I also think about the agency I have in trying to create, to be my full self within public policy. And so I'm always thinking, okay, how can I bring colors and plants and art and healing into this space? And for me, it's decisions. It's how are decisions being made and who has the power to make decisions? And how do I get my voice in that space? And how can I become a part of that space?
Yeah, I'm with Brett. I think when I think about the term policy, public policy, it is those formal spaces. It's the back rooms. It's the men in suits. It's the golfing, outings, and I think what I've gotten to do during my time at the Citizens League, and even now in this new space at the foundation, is break down what policy really is, which is coming up with the rules that govern us, the decision making. And so when I think about a policymaker today, I think about the strong home women I grew up with. Like, my mom is a policymaker. She's not going to use that term with all of us, but she made the rules for the family. They're the ones who, the women got together and they decided where we were going to go on vacation, what events we were going to hold this weekend, and they organized, right? They made those events happen and they made decisions for the family. And so when I talk to community and I say, hey, you were a policymaker all along. Now I want to show you what the formal rules are of a certain space that you might not be familiar with, but you were actually doing this this whole time.
Thanks for those responses. And to our audience who are trickling in, we're having a conversation with Brett, Pahoua, and Maura about public policy legislative solutions. And we want to hear from you, so please feel free to drop in questions. And some of the engagement questions are really, when you think of public policy, what does that conjure up for you? And while you're dropping those, your responses in, I will pose the next question, which is, how are you in your work pulling in community? I know, again, you all come from very different backgrounds, but how do you make sure that you're centering the voices of the community in your work? And anyone can jump in and answer.
I know for us, and I think Maura said it, we try to do our work in coalition also. And so we're always trying to be in different spaces. Like we're part of the coalition to increase teachers of color and American Indian teachers in Minnesota, and a number of other coalitions. That's one way. Another way is that I feel like we're constantly subjecting our policy tools, like our racial equity agendas, our report cards, which we used to do, our racial equity impact assessments, to community for feedback and to help us evaluate the effectiveness of our tools. And we take that information and apply that so that our tools start to reflect the voices of our networks, of community members in our networks. And our networks include artists and healers and advocates and lobbyists. So a diverse network of different people who still want to have a way to participate in policy, but again, with being their full selves. And that's what we're trying to figure out at Voices.
Yeah, at the Alliance, all of our ideas come from community-based organizations, and we form different coalition tables that bring together people who have shared interests, and we try and bridge across lobbyists, advocates, service providers, community-based cultural groups, neighborhood groups, bringing all those voices together to see what the shared interest is. And then making sure that the people most directly impacted by any decision really have a voice in shaping what the policy solutions are, so that they come from the narrative and lived experiences of people who are experiencing the greatest harm and the greatest trauma from our current and historic systems of racialized capitalism. And one of the things that we do is we bring community to the Capitol and fill up the hearing rooms and displace some of those people that Brett and Pahoua talked about in their suits and in their high heels and whatever. And it really creates a different feeling in the room when we're able to do that, and when we're able to have large rallies at the Capitol. But in our networks, we also have people who are professional lobbyists who are some of those people in suits. And what we try and do is bring them out to the community on a regular basis, so that there's a pressure at the Capitol as session goes on to compromise on things and to make deals that can be counted as wins, but maybe are just like a 10%, 10 cent raise in the minimum wage or in the MFIP investments. And so when we bring folks out into community on a weekly basis to report on what they're doing and where the conversation is and where the compromises might be being pushed, and they get real-time feedback from people about what is and is not an acceptable compromise from their perspective. I think in the nonprofit world, we're often pushed to deliver outcomes on a 2-year timeline or a 1-year timeline that we can then report as outcomes that are wins, even if they're not meaningful wins in people's lives. And so by bringing the folks who spend most of their time inside the Capitol back out into community on a regular basis for reality checks has been one of the most effective tools for making sure that we don't get caught up in that backroom bargaining that Pahoua talked about on the golf courses.
At the Citizens League, there was a really beautiful operating principle in that those most impacted by the issue were part of defining the problem and coming up with the solution. So this idea of co-creating with community, I know I speak for so many communities who feel like they're just studied and overstudied and brought in at the end to validate, and things end up going the way that certain groups want it to go without really their true and meaningful involvement all the way through the process. And so but I say that, and I say that for an organization like the Citizens League that was, started in 1952, that was largely white-led and white men-led. And so it was an organization that was known to formal policymakers, but really not known to the communities that I come from. And so I spent a great deal of work, like Brett and Maura have said, in coalition and in partnership with community-based organizations. They had to trust me in order to trust the organization that I was representing, and that's taken a lot of time. But I think that the proof is always in the pudding, and it's in the way that you actually involve people. And so over time, communities saw how they were involved, in that policy making with us. And I think that's brought in, that had brought in more work and more kind of collaborative work to the citizens. Again, I think that that's made a difference out in community. And happy to talk about that further on specifics, but do you actually do what you say? I think is something that guides my work and my thinking.
I want to acknowledge Brooke Murphy made a comment about public policy to make it more concrete decision-making that influence roads and transportation, education legislation, school housing systems, etc. So here at the center, and if I can sort of pull from that a little bit, here at the center, we focus a lot on advancing an inclusive economy. When you think of public policy that affects all of the things that Brooke talked about, can you say there's one or two that we absolutely need to advance an inclusive economy and close all of the gaps? I know I'm giving you a really heavy question, but in your work, if you had to say absolutely, here are the one or two things that we need to really just focus on, can you say that, and what would that be?
I personally couldn't say that. I believe that the issues in our lives are very intersectional, and that, you know, if we just focus on investing in the transit infrastructure and we don't think about how that connects people to jobs, we're lost. If we just focus on connecting people to jobs and don't think about stable and safe housing and tenant protections, we're lost. If we just focus on decreasing the prison industrial complex and not on shifting what public safety means in each of our communities, we're lost. So when I think about community, when I work with community members, community-based organizations, they come from the reality that all of these issues are deeply intersectional in their lives. It's when we get into the public policy making arena that things become siloed and people forget that that these things don't exist in a vacuum, and that changing one lever doesn't create the transformational change that we need after generations of trauma. That's my perspective.
Yeah, yeah, that's absolutely right, the intersectional perspective. But I also think that there needs to be a focus on economic opportunity in communities of color, especially for entrepreneurs of color. There needs to be some kind of racial equity fund that helps entrepreneurs of color gain access to capital that they need when they're trying to start a business. And I can speak from my own experience. There are all these different, organizations, there's DEED, there's all these grants that seem available for minority and equity development, different CDFIs, but there's still this hurdle of they won't fund you unless you can come up with this 10, 20% on your own of whatever loan you're asking for. And that's a burden because I don't come from wealth like that. And I know a lot of other entrepreneurs of color don't have access to just friends where they can get 10,000 from here, 10,000 from there. So I think kind of in this line of reparations, there needs to be a racial equity fund for economic development in different communities of color that solves that one issue. And I think that could be a step to kind of taking this integrated approach that Maura was talking about.
I totally co-sign with what Maura and Brett just said. All these issues that we talk about are at the intersections of the issues. So you can't talk about transportation without talking about housing, without talking about workforce development. If I was forced to, I would say the area that I think we need to move forward in one direction to support is around wealth building, which Brett, I think gets a little bit to your point. Because I think when we think about, and that's still a giant bucket, but I think when we think about it in terms of wealth building, then stable housing is a piece of that. Access to transit is a piece of that. Workforce development is a piece of that. Strong educational and policy is a piece of that. And so I think it starts to aggregate those seemingly disparate pieces that I think people want it to be tidy. And so we pull them apart, but they all interact with one another. And that's the space that I would like to see more collaboration and more focus on. And there are those who are working in that space now. But I could see a rallying around the wealth building piece, because that's how we're really going to move our community to a place where they want to be, and where we need to go.
We had a question come in about we need to advance disability in public policy, and which I absolutely agree with, and feeds into everything you've talked about how all of these issues are interconnected. And I just posed a question into the chat box for the audience, which is, what has your experience at the Capitol or with policy? What has your experience been so far? And while people are chiming in on that, I'm curious to hear from you, going back to we need to advance disability in public policy. Where does public policy take place? And Pahoua, if you don't mind, maybe starting with that. I know you've worked with the city of St. Paul, and there are many different levels from the city to, so how can people sort of engage with all of their different policymakers at every level to discuss some of these issues?
I want to make sure I get your question correct, Ethelind. So do you want me to comment on the advancing disability, or is it where does one engage at what level in government around policy?
I think probably let's start with at what level, and then we can get deeper into the different, yes, at what level?
Yeah, I think that given what's in the news, given what's on Twitter, I think often we see what's happening or not happening in Washington, D.C., or even at the state capitol. And I'm a firm believer that the biggest impact that one can have is locally, where you live, in your neighborhood, in your city. And so the places where the Citizens League, I think, did some of our most impactful work was with local government, with cities. So the piece that I know I'm really proud of, and the work that I got to do at the Citizens League during my time, was the work that we did with the city of St. Paul around building out what that minimum wage ordinance should look like. How does it serve that community? And it gave me an opportunity to work with workers, small and mid-sized businesses, ethnically owned businesses, family-owned businesses, along with large employers and the city, and with union and advocacy groups. And that was a really tough project because it was such an important issue. But we created a space where those who have not had an experience being at a table such as that one felt supported, because we made sure that everyone got a chance to build up their knowledge on the terms, on the access points to making these kinds of policy changes. And so it can happen at all levels. People can be engaged at all levels, as you'll hear from Brett and Maura. I have found that at the local level, that's where we've been able to make the most difference, and that the timeline's just a little bit shorter. It's harder to get things done up at the Capitol. That's a 2, 3, 4 year cycle sometimes to move policy. Not that it's not possible, but it's just a longer road.
Thanks for that comment. We have from Kate, and Kate said, the system is designed to be difficult to access. However, once you're able to, it becomes a little bit clearer. And Kate, can I put you on the spot just to share a little bit about your experience so far? I know she was. Maybe she can't hear me. So, oh, she cannot unmute. So we'll continue with the discussion so far. And so the next question I want to ask is about really on data. How are you using data to advocate for anti-racist policies in your work?
So I want to talk about a specific campaign that I've been part of for 10 years. It's the Higher Minnesota Coalition, which is about employment disparities in our state. And we got started at the Capitol in 2009, right after President Obama was elected. And there was this great sense of optimism in our communities, but also a sense that the giant stimulus package that was being passed in DC was not going to benefit communities of color in Minnesota equitably, because it was going to hit systems that had never delivered equitable results for people of color, and that was just used to operating in a certain way and by certain processes and relationships that were not deeply rooted in communities of color. So we went and formed a giant community-based coalition led by Summit Academy in North Minneapolis, but like with 70 different participating organizations. We flooded the Capitol and we asked for some very basic things, including just a few $1 million in job training resources that were targeted to BIPOC communities, and quarterly reporting on who was actually getting the jobs from the stimulus. And there was such massive resistance to that. People talked about being post-racial. People talked about that being unnecessary, that they were race, that they didn't see race, that, you know, with Obama's election, race was no longer an issue in the United States. So just asking for very basic data became a hugely challenging thing. Nobody was comfortable at the Capitol and even talking about, well, not nobody, but almost nobody was kind of comfortable talking about race. Right now, with that initiative, we are still in partnership with the State Department, MnDOT, and now we are getting payroll information in real time, disaggregated by race, on every MnDOT road project in the state of Minnesota, so that we can be asking contractors and unions what's going on if a specific project is not meeting its goals. And that has been so important. And I think it's very important that it's disaggregated, that it's not just BIPOC communities in one bucket, because we know that white supremacy functions in different ways for different communities of color. The barriers for one community are not the same as the barriers for another community. And if we want to have the right solutions, we need to understand where we're missing the mark very precisely. And that's both disaggregated by race, but also by zip code sometimes, so that we understand what those barriers are as well.
Yeah, the same thing at Voices. We've been working on at the Capitol an act called the All Kids Count Act, which is data disaggregation for student data. And again, along lines of race and ethnicity, for all the reasons Maura mentioned, because without that, you have this notion of the model minority myth that gets exacerbated if you don't disaggregate the data and understand who each community is in their own uniqueness and their own ethnic ways of being. But also, I think we're also interested in doing something a little bit more at Voices, kind of going beyond, and that's understanding what it means to democratize notions of what data is. Because when we talk about data, there's a value placed on data and in these public policy spaces, and that's empirical or quantitative data. But we're talking about not just qualitative. What about faith-based data? What about spiritual data? These are reflections of all of our communities, especially within communities of color. So there needs to be, it's connecting data to who we are in our communities and how we are in the world that we're struggling with. You know, we're trying to figure out, okay, how do we bring this data to these public policy conversations?
And I would add that, like, I'll give you a specific example of how we use data in policymaking. In 2015 was the passage of the higher education attainment goal. And there, in that specific bill, it called out specific benchmarks for different ethnic groups. And we asked for disaggregated data to be collected, because if you took a look at the data that was that had existed at that time only, you could see, for example, in the Asian, big bucket Asian grouping, that, oh, we were doing quite well. But when that data was disaggregated, we knew that our Hmong students, our Lao students, were not doing well. And so having that data disaggregated allowed us to really target the resource to meet specific groups' needs, rather than going, oh, they're just fine, we don't really need to pay attention to that group. So that's one very specific thing that we did tied to that goal. And disaggregating that data was not easy because data is messy and it was everywhere. And so just getting good data for one thing is something that I learned a great deal about, that it's not readily available. Sometimes it's not collected. And then when you get it, it's not complete or as clean as you would like. And then I'll just add on to what Brett mentioned. Data is obviously really important. In the example that I gave you is I think a really kind of a clear example, but every data point has a story to tell. And it's the storytelling around the data that actually gets people to move. I can throw up data all day long, and I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if it makes a difference, but that data with the storytelling is what I've seen move people to either support a bill, support a cause. And so I think that storytelling piece is really important too, along with the technical data.
I want to read a question from the chat box. So it says, Brett and Pahoua, your comments deeply resonated with me about what they think about when we think about policy. We have begun to host what we call resident boot camps to help train residents who live in our residential facilities about how to engage with legislators. What types of things should we consider when supporting them, so all of you, to be empowered to go before legislators and engage in the decision-making process? Thank you for the question.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Oh, I love that question.
Yeah.
So if I were still at the Citizens League, I'm going to look to my friend Kate, who now is the executive director at the Citizens League. But if I were still there, to the person who asked the question, to Nicole, I think it is, I would just give you my training curriculum. I'm a believer that no one has to recreate the wheel. And so we have this amazing leadership program called Capital Pathways, where we train and coach and mentor young college students of color to understand what happens up at the Capitol, what is the legislative process, who does what are these titles connected to the legislators' names, what does the majority leader do, et cetera. What does the calendar look like? When are you too late to make a difference in the session? So we have all of that wrapped in a curriculum that we tested over time, and we always enhance it depending on what's new and different. And so there's a part of me that would just love to give that away to you. And I bet my friend Kate will do that. I hope she will. Because I think understanding the rules allows you to know how to make best use of your time, right? And that, along with the strategizing of whom to talk to when, there are times when you will need to speak to someone whom you disagree with because you need to build those unlikely alliances to move legislation. And so my short answer to you is we have something prepared, and I would love to be able to share with you.
Yeah, let me just add, I was in the kind of the brother or sibling program to Capital Pathways. It's the community equity program now at Wilder. And it was, the thing that helped me was that I was with a community of, you know, I think nonprofit leaders at the time. It was about 10 of us, maybe 12 to 15 of us, but we were all working together. We built a community, and we were able to share and have that space to be able to share what we were learning. We were brought to the Capitol. We were interacting with different legislators and different officers at the Capitol, different legislative aides, commissioners, just people from all different sectors in the Capitol. And again, that being in that community was really, really helpful because, you know, when I got here, you know, there's the legislative website, but that's daunting. Like when I looked at that website to try to figure that out by myself, and it was just, it's too much. I'm still learning. So to have that community, and I'm still in community with a lot of the people that I was in the program with. So yeah, that's really important.
The only thing that I would add is that it can be helpful to start with some concrete examples of policies that are impacting your residents' lives, so that there are rules in place that dictate certain things that they're experiencing every day. And if you can clearly draw the lines to where those decisions were made, and then ask residents what they think about those rules.
Thank you, and thanks again, Nicole, for the question. And as we wait for more questions to come in, Brett, if I can throw this question at you, because I know you're very interested in education. And in Minnesota, we're one of the, in terms of the achievement gap and opportunity gap, one of the worst in the nation. And a lot of it, as we talk about anti-racist policies, can be traced to, yes, anti-racist policies that continue to perpetuate these gaps. We now have a record of BIPOC legislators, including the first who's chairing the Ways and Means Committee. Do you have hope? What can they do in developing these anti-racist solutions? Should we even be putting the pressure on them? But what do you hope for that as we see the numbers of BIPOC legislators increase?
I hope that like an organization like Voices for Racial Justice can use our networks and coalitions to really gather and support and work in collaboration with all these legislators, the Posse Caucus. And in a practical way, I really want to talk, and we've had conversations with many of the legislators now who are not in these positions of leadership about this tool that we have at Voices called the Racial Equity Impact Assessment. And it's just a tool that ensures that when policies are proposed, that we're thinking about racial equity, and it does it in very specific ways by answering who's most impacted. Are there any disparities that need to be addressed? How do we address them? Can a policy be sustainably successful? And so we've had discussions about, well, is there a way that we could use this tool in legislation at some point of the legislative process in proposing policies? And so in a practical sense, that's what I would hope. And I have all the faith in these legislators, but they can't do it. They can't do it alone. And it's not, I don't want to put pressure on them. I want to support them and work in collaboration with them and know that they have a community outside that's working right along with them.
Pahoua, Maura, any other thoughts on Brett's response and the question in general?
I strongly agree with what Brett said about supporting them. I also think that includes having some direct conversations with them individually about inside-outside strategies. And sometimes an outside pressure strategy can actually be supportive of them taking a slightly more moderate strategy inside the Capitol, so that it is clear to a broader audience that there are community members who want even more radical change than what the Posse Caucus leaders are trying to do. So I think as long as we're in a trusting relationship that's communicative, and that people understand that there is a strength to having a community voice that is calling for deeper reparations, then what they're able to get inside the Capitol can be strengthening their hands. And I see that with the administration as well, with the Lieutenant Governor. I mean, people have a sophistication about understanding that they're constrained in ways that community is not. And we're constrained in ways, we have different sources of power and we need to use all of them.
Yeah, I don't know that I have much to add to what Brett and Maura have already said. I will just say it is a tough job to be a legislator of color. It is a tough job. There are politics that they're dealing with up at the Capitol. They're getting heat and pressure from their community. Not everybody understands what a legislator can and can't do from the community. And so I think that there's already a lot of pressure on them. And I'm not saying that there are times when there's needed pressure to be put on them, but I think that it's a really tough job. And I'm really thankful that this year we have, more legislative color legislators than we've ever had before. And I think it's a high burnout job. So I think about that word of support that Brett used is so critical. It's what do they need? What is that outside inside strategy? How do we give them cover when they need it? How do we build support when they need it? How do we back off when they need it? And it is all part of building that trusting relationship with them. And it's not about winning today, but it's about what will get us on that road to progress long term.
Pahoua, if I could just stay on you just for a second. So we've talked about, you've all shared your insights on community, on legislators. And now with your work at the St. Paul, Minnesota Foundation, I'm curious about how foundation fits into that, right? Foundations, they've always sort of held a role in defining change. Now, how do you see your role in creating a more inclusive, anti-racist economy?
Well, like I said, I'm 7 months on the job, so I'm bringing to this job my own frustrations of that I had when I was leading an organization that was focused on public policy. I think a foundation's job obviously is to make grants out into community to support really good on the ground community work. I think that a lever that foundations and the philanthropic community have not used fully is the power of their influence and their voice in public policy. So in addition to grant making, what else can we do? And that's something that one of the reasons why I'm really excited about this new role is we have said at the foundation, we know we've got to do more. And Pahoua, we know you're bringing that skill set in here. What does that look like? And so over time, I would like the St. Paul, Minnesota Foundation, but all foundations, to think about if we truly want to live our mission to help our communities thrive, it's not going to be just through grant making. It's going to be through a holistic approach of how do we put our words and our actions with the money that we grant out into community. And so that's what I will say. And like it's going to take time, and it's going to be in partnership with the Brett and the Mauras too. So this isn't, again, foundations doing it in isolation, but it's saying, we already support Voices for Racial Justice. What's on your public policy agenda? Or more at the Alliance, what are you guys doing that we should know? How do we help you further your mission through the work that you're doing up at the Capitol?
Mm-hmm. And Maura, I want to sort of ask you a similar question. At the center, we talk a lot about engaging cross-sector leaders. So foundations, legislators, community leaders, nonprofit partners, and then also corporate partners, right? So Maura, do you have any thoughts on how corporate and policy can also help in doing this work?
I'll say that I think that we're in a moment this year in Minnesota where the appetite for that engagement from the corporate sector is higher than it's ever been before. It's been surprising to me the number of different business leaders who've reached out to us over the past 6 months with a desire to be involved at a different level than they had been previously and moving a shared agenda. I think it's really important when we come together in coalition to understand what each entity's self-interest is. And I've been in coalitions that were forced partnerships between the public sector, the private sector, and the nonprofits, where the ultimate end goals were not the same, and therefore the coalitions were not successful. They weren't able to get their objectives met because the end goal that was most important to each party was really radically different. So I think it's important that we build those relationships based on a true understanding of each entity's self-interest and where there is genuine overlap and how we deepen the understanding of shared self-interest. And I think that's true with anybody that you're moving along a racial equity journey. I mean, as a white person, white people need to understand what our self-interest is in racial equity in order to stay motivated for the long term when things get hard and when it feels like there are losses to our position. But we know that by being in deeper, healthy relationships across our communities, we will live in a safer, more robust economy for everybody. And so I think really digging into that self-interest and building from a trusting foundation.
Speaking of building coalitions and from a trusting place, here's $1 million question in the chat box. How do we get to a place where all legislators, both parties, how do we get to a place to understand this is a nonpartisan issue and impacts all of Minnesota, not just metro issues? I'm not quite sure which issue we were talking about then, but let's expand it. How do we actually get legislators or parties, right, to understand that some issues are not nonpartisan? Can you share anything about that? Maybe Brett, we can start with you.
Yeah, that's a powerful question. I just think about racial equity, or like you're saying, anti-racist policy. And I think in addition to anti-racist, there needs to be what we're for, which is racial equity. And so I like to keep that in the conversation too. But I don't know, I don't know how we do that, honestly. Because when I think about racial equity, I think of work that is beneficial to everyone, but yet it still ends up being a partisan issue for some reason. And I don't know how to stop that from happening. I know I try to be vulnerable myself in having conversations about race. I don't try to shy away from race. I know in planning legislative strategies, there's always the talk of, okay, well, with these group of conservatives, you may not want to mention race because that won't go over so well with them. And it gets back to Maura's question, okay, well, then what constitutes a win? If we get a policy that's not explicit about race, then is that a win for racial equity? And I'm not certain it is, because I think a win for racial equity is having to address race and having to get comfortable with that, even though it's uncomfortable, but getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. And so creating those spaces maybe can get to how we create this environment where racial equity becomes a nonpartisan issue, is being vulnerable, exposing ourselves, but being explicit and naming the disparities. That's the best I can say about that.
Pahoua, Maura, anything to add to that?
Whether you want to talk about race or talk about racial equity or racial justice, and then our fates are tied. So we're going to have to talk about it. And if you don't want to talk about it, if you don't want to use the word race, but you want to talk about economic mobility, then fine, let's talk about that. But that to me is connected to race and racial justice. So our fates are tied. If you don't want encampments happening around your neighborhood because you think that this is going to bring down the value of your home, then I think you need to talk about race, and you need to help us in this movement towards wealth building, as I mentioned earlier, right? So our fates are tied. So this isn't a Metro Greater Minnesota issue. This isn't a partisan issue. This is a human issue. And I think to see the humanity in what we are all trying to work towards, and I'm hopeful. So even with the rhetoric that we've seen this year, I'm hopeful that at our core, this is actually what we want for our fellow human. And I think we get caught up in the very real short-term fighting of what today is. And there isn't ever going to be enough money to meet all the needs that we want to address. But I think that slowly, I'm hoping that we can build understanding, build some trust, create those unlikely coalitions that will move towards the things that we want for our community. But I think Brett's right. There is no easy answer. Like, I don't know what the thing is. I just know what it can't be, what it cannot continue to be what it is. And I think COVID has amplified many things. It's made some things clear for me about what's important. What are some of the things that need to, in the sequencing of what do we do first, clear in my mind, but there is no silver bullet answer that I have other than it's going to affect you in some way. So are you going to join us?
I couldn't agree more with the "our fates are tied" framework. I believe inextricably linked is a phrase that was used many decades ago that I hold in my day-to-day understanding of the world and in the center of the way that I do the work. And one thing that I'll say is that the Alliance started as a largely almost entirely white organization. And there was a time in the early 2000s where we were in deep partnership with communities of color, but they were not members. And there was some miscommunication and mistrust that happened. And we brought in a facilitator to help us unpack. And one of the questions she asked was, when did race enter the dynamic? And different people started to say, oh, it happened around X. And her lesson was, no, race was always part of the dynamic. And as white people, we don't always know or recognize that race is always part of the dynamics in this country in every interaction. And we're simultaneously tied in some really warped ways to our racialized identity as white people, and we invisibilize it, and we pretend it's not there, and we pretend race isn't there until a person of color is in the room. So I really think that working across the divide includes helping people see that race is always part of the conversation, whether we name it or not.
Thanks. As we wrap up our time together, there are two questions that are in the chat box that I want to read, and whoever has the answer, please jump in. The first one, why is the disability unemployment rate at 81%? That is a staggering number, and didn't even know that, but do any of you know why the rate is at 81%? And maybe even then, knowing that that's the rate, what are some things we can do as a society in all of our roles to try to solve that?
I don't know.
I don't know why it's at 81% either. I do know there's a resource at the state. There's the Minnesota Council on Disability that may be able to, at least in the state, help us understand that more and maybe come up with some solutions, help us come up with solutions.
I mean, I don't know that I know the answer for the 81% either, but I mean, I think all of us here probably will agree that there are great prejudices against our disability community. I mean, I hope that one of the silver linings of COVID is that, we could all work from home and be productive, which is something that I know advocates for the disability community have wanted, have advocated for, and were told no. So we were not ready, employers were not ready to make those kinds of accommodations. And now here we are all at home doing it. And so I'm hoping that that provides the needed opening to say, in fact, we can do it, we should do it. And I think being, we talked about the various privileges that we have. And I think being able-bodied, we forget and we don't think about those who are impacted because of their disability. And I think that is something that doesn't get enough attention, frankly. And there's also, I remember when I was working on a transit study committee, a big eye-opening moment for me was there are advocates who do great work, but also, having someone at the table who is actually using Metro Mobility, who is actually a paratransit rider, to be at that table to advocate for what she's experiencing in her life was, again, we forget sometimes who needs to be at the table. And so I will just say there needs to be more work around surfacing and lifting up narratives from our disability community, and that we don't do enough.
There's no substitute for lived experience. It's transformative to conversations.
Absolutely. Thank you all for sharing and providing your thoughts on the question. And thanks for the question. I have one more, which seems like a good one to try to wrap up, to try to close with. It's racial equity is identified as a pillar of the Biden-Harris plan. And they're talking pretty boldly about racial justice at the same time wanting to shift partisanship to collective interest, the common good. Do you feel hopeful about this new narrative in public policy actions?
I can start. I'm not familiar with that, but just from what I read there, it sounds hopeful that the language is there. But at the same time, I'm skeptical and I want to study it. And I think it's going to be important who they work with, who they're collaborating with, how things are being done, to make sure that it's effective. Because when I started here and we started doing our racial equity legislative report card, where we would grade legislators on advancing racial equity, in 2006, you know, we were applauding the language of racial equity being at the Capitol, or seeing the language of racial equity more at the Capitol. But, and in, you know, 10 years later, when we did our last report card, the legislature still got a grade of D in terms of advancing racial equity. And there's this whole thing about the Minnesota paradox, where Minnesota does well in all these indicators of success: education, good parks, good healthcare system. But when you do a racial equity analysis, it's at the bottom of the country, in the country almost. And so there's got to be more than just the language. There's got to be the action to follow it up. And the action has got to be culturally appropriate. It's nuanced and it's intersectional. So if all those have to be a part of it. And so I just want to still hold out and say I'm analyzing it and want to study it and contribute to it if I can.
Yeah, I'm with Brett. Will you do what you say?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the language, the words, the headlines fill a checkbox.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes people may feel they've done something because it feels good to have the statement be made, but the proof will be in what will you do behind that.
There's been a tremendous amount of damage done to this country since its origins, obviously, but also specifically over the past 4 years. And the amount of work in front of all of us is tremendous. So I'm not sure hopeful would be the right word to characterize my mood, but determined and really grateful to be in relationship with so many other people who are committed and who I know won't let there be empty rhetoric with no meaningful change.
All right, thank you, thank you, thank you. So grateful to the three of you for joining us and partnering with us this year. To our audience, thank you for joining in and all your questions. We hope you found some insights incredibly useful. And please join us at noon for our main session on the digital stage. And it will feature corporate executives really talking about how we all reckon together to rise together. And I think it feeds into what some of our panelists talked about earlier, the idea that, yes, we all really do better when we all do better, in quoting the late Senator Wellstone. So again, thank you and hope to see you at the other stage with the rest of the panel. And thank you, Pahoua Hoffman, thank you, Maura Brown, and Brett Grant for your time today.
Thank you, Ethelind.
Thank you, Ethelind. Thank you,
Yeah,
Brett.
thank you, Ethelind. Thank you, Pahoua. Thank you, Maura. Thank you, everybody.
Running tech. Thank you.